Hello everyone, welcome to Mediverse Atlas, and today's topic of discussion is cardiac output, which is an important essay question from physiology. So, what is cardiac output basically? So, we need to know the definition of cardiac output, okay? So, it is the amount of the blood that is pumped from each ventricle. So, we know that heart consists of atria and ventricle. So, the blood that is pumped by the ventricles is called as cardiac output, okay? Then how do we calculate the cardiac output? What is the formula to calculate the cardiac output? It is nothing but stroke volume multiplied by heart rate, okay? This is about the cardiac output. So how much is the stroke volume? It is about 70 ml, and heart rate we know very well, it is about 72 beats per minute, and hence the cardiac output will be the multiplication of both the values. By that we'll be getting 5040 ml, or it is also called as 5 liter per minute. So these units are very important, okay? This is also asked in practicals. So this is about the cardiac output. So this is about the definition of cardiac output. Then let us come to another definition, that is cardiac reserve. What is cardiac reserve? The maximum volume of the blood that can be pumped out by the heart above the normal limit. So we know that the cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute. So if the heart is pumping about 6 liters or 6.5 liters per minute, then the additional 1 to 1.5 liter is what we call it as cardiac reserve. So the normal limit is about 5 liter, right? Whereas it is pumping 1 to 1.5 liters above the normal limit. So this additional volume of the blood that is pumped by the heart, that is called as cardiac reserve. And the heart usually pumps this additional blood when the body needs more oxygen, as in cases of in athletes where they need to run very fast, so the muscle requires more oxygen. So in such conditions the cardiac reserve comes into action. Then what is ejection fraction? So basically all these basic definitions are very important in order to understand the cardiac output, okay? So this ejection fraction is nothing but, before that we need to know what is end diastolic volume. So basically, in precise words, end diastolic volume is nothing but the volume of the blood that is present in the ventricles in the cardiac cycle, okay? That is called as end diastolic volume. So this end diastolic volume that is ejected by the each ventricle, that is called as ejection fraction, okay? This is about the ejection fraction. So these are all the basic definitions, okay? Cardiac output, cardiac reserve, and ejection fraction. So let us come to the topic. So what are the variations in the cardiac output? So variations include physiological variations and pathological variations. So the physiological variation means that in the physiological limit the variations occur, okay? It can be altered, it can come back to normal, that is physiological variations. Whereas the pathological variations are can lead to diseases, okay? That is about the physiological and the pathological variations. So what are the physiological variations? The first variation that we get to see is in the age. So cardiac output, it is different in children and it is different in adults. Why? Cardiac output is less in children because of less blood volume, whereas in adults it is more because of more blood volume. More is the blood volume, more will be the blood pumped by the heart, and more will be the cardiac output, okay? Then the next factor is gender. So in females the cardiac output is less than males, the same reason, because of less blood volume. So the blood volume is less in children as well as in the females. So that's why it is the second factor that affects the cardiac output. And also the reason for that is because of menstruation there is blood loss, and also because of estrogen production. Estrogen is also a hormone that prevents the erythropoiesis production, okay? So that's why the females have lesser cardiac output compared to males. Next comes the environmental temperature. So the temperature also plays an important role in maintenance of cardiac output. So as the temperature increases, the cardiac output also increases. Whereas when the temperature decreases, the cardiac output decreases, because the temperature is directly proportional to the cardiac output, okay? The another factor is diurnal variations. So what is diurnal variations? So it is also similar to temperature only, because cardiac output, it is more during afternoon and less during early morning. Why? Because the temperature difference is there in afternoon and morning. Usually the temperature is more during afternoon, okay, than compared to early morning. So this is also similar to that of diurnal variation. This is because of physical activities. There is difference in physical activities. So the person, whenever the physical activity is more, the cardiac output will also be the in higher quantity, okay. Example as in exercise. When the person is in sleeping, when the person is sleeping, the cardiac output will be less, okay. Next comes the posture. So when the posture of the body changes from supine to erect. So what do you mean by supine position? When the person is lying down, lying on the bed, okay. Then what do you mean by erect? When the person is standing. So when the position of the body changes from sleeping position to standing position, the cardiac output increases, okay. Cardiac output increases due to the gravity that acts more when the person is standing. So whenever the person is standing, the blood which is there, that goes towards the legs, okay, because of the effect of gravity. So gravity is the force that pulls the blood downwards. So because of that, the heart will have to pump more blood in order to supply the upper parts of the body, okay. That is why the cardiac output is more when the person is standing. The next one is exercise. So we know very well that the cardiac output is high during exercise. Why? Because of the body's increased demand of oxygen. That's why there is sympathetic stimulation, okay. There is sympathetic stimulation that will cause increase in cardiac output to meet the increased oxygen demand, okay. Now what are the pathological variations? That means which are harmful to the body, okay. This cannot be altered. This cannot be altered by the compensatory mechanisms. That's why we call it as pathological variations, okay. So in pathological variations, we are having two types of factors increasing cardiac output and factors decreasing cardiac output. So what are the factors increasing the cardiac output? First one is fever, okay. During fever, there is high oxidative processes. Because of that, the cardiac output is increased during fever above the normal limit, that is more than 5 liters per minute. In anemia, so what is anemia? There is decreased blood, okay, the decreased RBC count in the blood or decreased ability of the blood to carry oxygen, that is called as anemia. So during anemia also there is increased cardiac output, because the body compensates the RBC loss by increasing the blood flow, okay. This anemia is seen in hypoxia also. So in hypoxia, due to hypoxia also anemia can occur, okay. The third condition is hyperthyroidism. So in hyperthyroidism there is increased BMR, okay. So the thyroid hormones, they regulate the heart function also. By increasing the cardiac output, there is increased T3 T4 production, okay. This will increase the cardiac output. And the BMR, it also affects on the BMR, okay, body basal metabolic rate. Now what are the factors decreasing the cardiac output? The first one is hypothyroidism, opposite to hyperthyroidism, which I think I don't need to explain again. Then comes the atrial fibrillation. This is an important factor. So what is atrial fibrillation? There is incomplete filling of blood in the ventricles, okay, that is called as atrial fibrillation. So whenever the ventricles are the one which pump the blood, okay, which are contributing to the cardiac output. Now the blood is not reaching ventricles only, that means that the cardiac output will automatically be low, okay. That is one important factor that decreases the cardiac output. The next one is cardiac failure, where the heart cannot pump the blood. There is inability of the heart to pump the blood, okay. The fourth one is hemorrhage. What is hemorrhage? Blood loss, okay. Due to any external or internal factor, there are blood loss in the body that will lead to decreased blood volume, and because of that there is decreased cardiac output, okay. Now let us discuss another most important heading in the cardiac output, that is what are the factors affecting and maintaining the cardiac output, okay. So basically there are four important major factors that are involved in maintaining the cardiac output in the body. What are those? What are the factors that are contributing in the cardiac output? The first one is venous return, okay. The second one is heart rate. Third one is peripheral resistance, and the fourth one is force of contraction, okay. We need to discuss each factor in detail, okay. So venous return is nothing but the amount of the blood returning to the heart from the different parts of the body. Venous return is nothing but the deoxygenated blood that is reaching the heart through superior and the inferior vena cava, okay. That is about the venous return. So venous return is another an important factor which is again contributed because of respiratory pump, muscle pump, gravity and venous pressure. So all these factors ultimately contribute in venous return. So whenever these factors come into action, at that time the venous return will be more. Okay, so let us study each factor in detail. What is respiratory pump? So the first one is respiratory pump. Okay, so the mechanism is very important, how the respiratory pump occurs. So what is respiratory pump? The respiratory activities that increase the cardiac output is what we call it as respiratory pump. Now what are the respiratory activities? That is, during the inspiration, what happens? So during inspiration there is expansion of thoracic cage. Okay, because of expansion of the thoracic cage, there is increased negativity in the intrapleural pressure. So all these things you'll be able to understand once you are done with the respiration chapter. Okay, you'll understand this clearly once you're done with the respiration of physiology. So whenever there is expansion of thoracic cage, what happens is the next step is there is increased negativity in the intrapleural pressure. So because of that, what will happen is there is increase in the diameter of inferior vena cava. Okay, so this increase in the diameter, what will happen if the diameter is more? Suppose this is the initial diameter, and because of inspiration the diameter of the inferior vena cava has increased. So whenever there is increased diameter, it will pump more blood, right? It will take up more blood. This is how it will increase the venous return. Now if venous return is more, that means there is increase in cardiac output. Okay, this is one factor. Another way how the venous return is increased because of respiratory pump is by descent of diaphragm. So during inspiration there is contraction of diaphragm, right? That means the diaphragm will contract, that will descend, that will lead to increase in the intra-abdominal pressure. So whenever the diaphragm descends, whenever the diaphragm contracts, the intra-abdominal pressure increases. So because of that, the compression of abdominal veins occurs. So in abdomen there are various vessels, okay, arteries and veins. So this compression of the veins, whenever the veins are compressed, that will lead to increase in the venous return. There is increase in venous pressure. Okay, that will contribute to increased venous return. So this is how the respiratory pump comes into action. Okay, the second factor is muscle pump. What is muscle pump? The muscular activity that helps in the return of the blood to the heart. The same as we discussed of the respiratory pump. So in muscle pump, what happens? The muscular activities that increase the cardiac output is what we call it as muscle pump. So in the muscle, there are various veins. Okay, the veins are present. These veins, let me show you by the help of diagram. So if you observe this diagram, we can basically see here that the muscle is present. So this is the muscle. Okay, so the veins are present in the muscle only. Okay, so whenever the muscle contracts, as in when we are walking or when we are running or when we are jumping, so muscle contraction occurs, right? Whenever this muscle contracts, what happens is there is opening of the walls of the muscle. Okay, sorry, walls of the vein. Okay, these valves, they open in the unidirectional manner in this way. That will lead to the pumping of the blood upward direction in the unidirectional way. Okay, in the upward direction the blood is pumped. That will lead to increase in venous return. This blood ultimately reaches the inferior vena cava, and through this there is increase in venous return, and because of that there is increase in cardiac output. So this is about the muscle pump. Okay, and the third factor that contributes the venous return is gravity. So we have already discussed this point that whenever the gravity acts on the person, gravity acts more when the person is standing in the standing position, whereas when the person is lying, the gravity acts less. So whenever the person changes his position from the sleeping position to the standing position, gravity acts more on the body. Okay, because of that the cardiac output will be more. Why? Because heart has to pump more blood in order to supply blood to the upper parts of the body, because the blood is pulled in the downward direction because of effect of gravity. Okay, this is about the gravity. Then the fourth factor is venous pressure. This is also very evident that venous pressure is the pressure that is exerted by the blood in the venous return. So if this is the if this is the vein and the blood is flowing in this direction towards the heart, okay, from the other parts of the body to heart. So whenever this blood is flowing in this way, there exerts pressure in the vessels, in the veins. That pressure is what we call it as venous pressure. So this venous pressure, if it is more, then more blood is pumped towards the heart, right? If the pressure is less, the cardiac output will be less. Okay, so these are all the factors that are affecting the venous return. What are those? Respiratory pump, muscle pump, venous pressure, and force and gravity. Okay, so these are the four factors that are affecting the venous return, and venous return is important factor affecting the cardiac output. So we are done with one factor. We need to discuss three more other factors. Okay, the second factor and the most important factor is heart rate. So what is heart rate? We know very well that the heart rate is nothing but the number of times the heart beats is called as heart rate per minute. Okay, that is called as heart rate. So we know the normal value of the heart rate, that is 60 to 100 beats per minute. Okay, this is the normal range of heart rate. So we know very well, we have already discussed this formula, that cardiac output is nothing but stroke volume multiplied by heart rate. So the cardiac output is affected by heart rate. So if the heart rate is more, the cardiac output will ultimately be more. If you apply basics physics, you'll understand that. Okay, so if the individual's heart rate is about 80 beats per minute, then the cardiac output will be 70 into 80. Okay, 70 is the stroke volume. So usually the 70 into 72 is the average heart rate. Okay, normal heart rate. So if this value is increasing, ultimately cardiac output will also increase. Okay, this is one of the important factor. The next factor is peripheral resistance. What do you mean by peripheral resistance? So it is resistance offered to the flow of the blood by blood vessels. Okay, the resistance offered to the flow of the blood by blood vessels. That means that whenever the blood is flowing, so let us assume this to be blood vessel. So this is the blood flowing in the blood vessel. Okay, so the blood vessel shows the property of peripheral resistance. So it will thereby prevent the flow of the blood. So it acts as resistant. Okay, it gives resistance to the flow of the blood, these blood vessels. So these blood vessels, they show the resistance to the flow of the blood. Hence the peripheral resistance is the property of blood vessels. Okay, so how does this affect cardiac output? So we know very well that is inversely proportional to cardiac output, because if the blood vessels are opposing the flow of the blood, that means they decrease the blood flow to the heart, right? So whenever there is decreased blood flow to the heart, the stroke volume will decrease, there is decreased venous return, there is decreased stroke volume, and thereby there is decreased cardiac output. So this is a factor that is inversely proportional to cardiac output. Okay, and the another important factor is force of contraction. So before that, we need to understand what is Frank-Starling law. What does this explain? Okay, what does this Frank-Starling law explain? So this Frank-Starling's law tells that under physiological limit, okay, under normal range, the force of contraction is directly proportional to the initial length of the muscle fiber. That means that suppose this is the ventricle. Okay, this is ventricle, and whenever, okay, let us take this as a ventricle, and before the pumping of the heart, okay, before the pumping of the heart, this is the ventricle. So the blood has to come into the ventricle so that the pumping of the heart occurs. So for the blood, whenever the blood enters the ventricle, there is stretching of the muscle fiber. Okay, whenever if you take water also, when you pour water into a substance, into a liquid into a cloth like substance, there is a stretching of the cloth, right? The same way the ventricular muscle also expands on exposure to the blood. So whenever the blood enters into the ventricle, there is stretching of the length of the muscle fiber. So the more is the stretching, more will be the cardiac output. That is what the law explains. So if the blood is more, there is more stretching. If the stretching is more, then the cardiac output will be more. That is what the Frank-Starling's law explains, and that we have to remember is under the physiological limit, under the normal ranges. Okay, so this initial length of the muscle, on what factor does this initial length of the muscle depends? As I have said, that it depends on the amount of blood. So if the blood amount of the blood coming is more, then there will be more stretching of the muscle. So that blood, what do we give the name of the blood is end diastolic volume. So if the end diastolic volume is more, that means if the blood coming to the ventricle is more, then there is more stretching of the heart muscle, of the ventricular muscular ratio. Okay, then that will lead to increased force of contraction, and that will ultimately lead to increased cardiac output. So this is what the law is trying to explain. Okay, this is also known as heterometric regulation of cardiac output. Okay, so I can explain this through this graph. If you observe this, this is end diastolic volume on x-axis and stroke volume on the y-axis. So as the end diastolic volume is increasing, the stroke volume is also increasing, right, up to a limit. So up to this limit it is increasing. After that it is becoming normal. That is why in the definition they have mentioned that up to normal physiological limit. Okay, so as the end diastolic volume, the blood entering the ventricle is increasing, the stroke volume is also increasing. It reaches the maximum, and here is when the pumping of heart occurs. Okay, this is what the graph is trying to explain. Okay, and the third factor is preload. What do you mean by preload? So end diastolic filling is preload to the ventricle. So another name of the end diastolic filling is what we call it as preload. So end diastolic volume, it is considered as the measure of preload. Okay, so these both the words are synonymous to each other. So simply preload is directly proportional to cardiac output. So more is the preload, more will be the cardiac output. Okay, then what is afterload? It is completely opposite to preload. That means after the cardiac pumping, after the pumping of the heart, after the cardiac output is ejected into the from the blood vessels, the remaining amount of the blood that is present in the ventricle is what we call it as afterload. Okay, the force against which the ventricles must contract and eject the further remaining blood. Okay, and eject the remaining blood is called as afterload. That means, see, the heart has pumped the cardiac output, but still there is some amount of the blood that is left in the ventricles that has to be pumped again by the ventricles with extra force. Okay, so that there is complete draining of the there is complete emptying of the ventricle. Okay, that is what we call it as afterload. So this afterload is additionally, it is inversely proportional to cardiac output. Why? Because if the afterload is less, that means more of the blood has been pumped already by the ventricular systole. Okay, that means it will contribute to cardiac output. If the afterload is more, that means the very less blood has been pumped initially. That's why it is inversely proportional to cardiac output. So afterload is supposed to be less. Okay, so these are all the factors that are affecting the cardiac output. I hope you guys understood this today's class, and I hope you like this video, and if you have any doubts, share it in the comments, and thank you for watching.